So this next section that we're going to look at is looking at reporting frameworks, tools and methodologies for change and for transparency. So there's two different, actually I think it's on the next slide. So there's two different ways in which we might use frameworks, methodologies and tools, and some of which we'll go through with you. So some of them are best used for measuring change, so changes that we see in the project, so that if we go back to one of those first slides, the content type things, the what does your business do type things. And then there's frameworks and methodologies for measuring transparency, and that's probably a bit more on the side of the process, so how is your business run side. So do we go through all of these? Yes, so we're going to go through all of these in a little bit of a high flyover of the different kinds of tools, and then we'll have a conversation to try and bring them all together on your tables. So the first, there's actually 2 points I would make around this one. The first is, I was having a couple of conversations outside about this impact measurement kind of area, and I think the thing I want to highlight is that in the same way as you practice whatever it is, I don't know, I'm thinking like practice law, medicine, the piano, golfing, whatever it is, it's a practice that will be developed over time. So there's no one way of doing it, there's different perspectives. And even, so Emma and I put these together, this is the first time we've co-presented. And so the way that I would order the content is a bit different to the way Emma would order the content. But it's just different ways of doing it, right? So it's just, I'd put that out there and just say impact measurement or management is a practice. And in the same way that you develop your practice around other areas, or your knowledge or experience around other areas, so will you with impact management. So there is no one way of measuring, and if you think about that previous slide we talked about when we measure, the different life cycles or stages of a business or project, and when we might measure, this kind of maps some of those methodologies and tools and frameworks that were on the previous slide across where they're most appropriate. So I'll take just a couple of examples. So the logic model, if you remember the logic model we had up here, you can use that to estimate and plan for impact. So if you think about the outcomes you're wanting to achieve, you can articulate those within a program logic. You can think a bit about what you hope to do in the first 12 months or whatever it is by kind of looking the short, medium and long-term outcomes and the logic behind those. But you can't really monitor your impact or evaluate your impact unless you attach other things to a logic framework. Does that make sense? So it's a tool that's useful in some instances, but without something else added to it, it's not really useful for these other things. And so similarly, social return on investment, which we'll talk a bit about, is pretty good for estimating impact and okay for monitoring, good for evaluating impact, but you can't really plan for impact through SROI. That's not what it's intended to do. It's intended to ask people about the kind of impact that your project has had, and so you can't do that at the very beginning, right? You kind of have to do that when they've had some experience with your project. Does that make sense? Cool. And the quasi-experimental methods, so the RCTs that Emma talked about, again, good for estimating, evaluating. You can't really use it in this middle sort of measurement, ongoing monitoring area. So social return on investment. We talk about this one first because it's quite sexy. People like this one. So effectively what social return on investment does is take the tangible and intangible benefits to the community, looks at the time and dollars invested into it, and gives you a dollar value. So at the end of an SROI analysis, you will have something that says, for every dollar invested in this program, it generated $2.15 in social return. That's what SROI does. In terms of implementing SROI, because I think that talking about how you do it gives you a bit of sense of the methodology, right? So you figure out what the scope is and identify the key stakeholders. And usually that is overwhelmingly the people that are impacted by the program or business that's being evaluated, right? Then you map the outcomes, and you do this through the interviews. So one of the things I really like about SROI is that it's very much about you talk to people who've been impacted by your project or business until you are hearing the same things over and over. You surface from them all of the impacts that they've seen for themselves. And so in that sense, it's very driven by clients, consumers, whoever it is that we're serving. and it is another way of really collecting stories, right? So effectively, even though SROI gives you this dollar value at the end of it, you are collecting stories through that process. So we map the outcomes, we evidence the outcomes and give them a value. And I want to be really clear that when you're evidencing the outcomes and giving them a value, you're making a series of assumptions. So we'll give you an SROI analysis in a bit for the activity, which is looking at, so it was the Rabbitohs, right? Souths. So one of the rugby teams, right?
One
a
on the
sporting
side.
team has a foundation which effectively is trying to increase the number of Indigenous students getting through to Year 12, right? And so their SROI analysis, effectively what they're doing is putting a dollar value, they're choosing what proxy it is, so how do you measure this, and what does it look like to have a successful outcome, getting all the way through to Year 12, and then what dollar value do you put on that? So is it that if kids are getting through all the way through to Year 12, they're not NEET, so they're not in employment, education and training, and therefore they're not receiving Centrelink benefits, and therefore that's a value that we want to attribute to that outcome? So the whole way along, after interviewing people, you're making these kinds of logic assumptions, right? You're going, okay, well, this kind of thing we're hearing from people, what kind of dollar value can we put on that? And that is assumptions, completely. So one of the other key elements of SROI is being really clear and transparent about your assumptions and documenting all of your assumptions, so that if someone wants to come and pick that up and go, well, why did you choose this financial proxy instead of this one, then people can kind of interrogate it in that way. So SROI, establishing the impact and calculating the SROI. There are spreadsheets that do this. Don't ever think that if you are engaging with SROI that you do the calculation. You just kind of put some of the things in and the spreadsheet generates it. And then reporting using and embedding whatever comes out of that SROI. So I think, yeah, for SROI, I would say those two key things, the assumptions and being clear about assumptions and understanding that effectively that's what underpins SROI, and also probably being clear about it really is another way of gathering stories, in effect. I also think that using a financial dollar value is really important in some ways, because I think you can see where this comes from, right? The idea is that you are being able to compare across projects. So there's something that you can look at 5 or 6 projects and go, oh, that dollar value is higher than that one, so that one must be more successful. I want to invest in that one because it generates higher social return. But if you kind of look underneath the hood and you see that all of this is underpinned by assumptions, it's still a bit challenging to say that you can actually do that. Is there anything you'd add with SROI? Okay. Results-based accountability. I'm going to have Emma talk about this one.
So, results-based accountability is actually more popular in Australia than in other countries. What results-based accountability does is it looks at the difference made to the client population, the clients being the participants in the program, but it sits that within the whole population. So those of you who've looked sort of at systems change, or when you're thinking that the program that's being run really does depend on the environment in which it's running. This method attempts to capture that. So it splits measurement into 2 things. Population accountability, where we look at indicators to do with the population, and then performance accountability, where we look at the things that we normally associate with impact measurements. So let's go on to the next one to see. So the questions asked are very clear. At the beginning, how much do we do? So using the logic model, we call these your inputs and outputs and your activities. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Some of these would be your outputs and some are outcomes. And even, I really don't like to get caught up too much on the semantics of whether something is an output or an outcome, because often it depends on the situation. It depends on whether it's an outcome for you. So something like staff turnover rate, you can imagine that for some programs that's a huge outcome, and that's something that you're really striving for, to try and get that down. But for other programs, it's very peripheral and just something you might want to record. The big question is anyone better off? This is where we start looking at individual skills and knowledge acquisition, changes in attitude and opinion, changes in behaviour, changes in circumstance.
Are there suggested ways on how we are measuring, say, we are meant to measure behaviour? So are there suggested tools on measuring behaviour, like prefer to use this tool rather than that tool?
There aren't. So neither of us sort of believe in prescribing to a particular tool or measure. If I was doing it, if I was starting a program new and looking at a whole new set of how I was going to measure behaviour change, one of my favourite resources, might have to email it around, is from NPC. They've done some outcome frameworks.
New Philanthropy Capital for the city, right?
But I think their website is npcthinks.org. And they've done some frameworks where you can click on like employment or education, and they've got like a list of indicators, and then either just sort of a list of metrics, or they have tools and links to the tools. So when it's something like improvement in attitude, they're like, here's a tool that you could actually use to measure an improvement in attitude. So they have done a full, sort of a look through, they've really researched it and gone through all the tools, and they are recommending, these tools for these indicators. So that's a great resource.
That's on npcthinks.org.
Yeah, I think we'll email you the link after this so that you've got it.
I'm going to just very quickly go through most significant change and London benchmarking group, and then we will get into the next activity quite quickly. So we tend to do this is have a lot of content, want to give you everything, right? And then we run behind. So most significant change is effectively storytelling. As a framework, you would not use it by itself, right? So I'll actually just go through the process. So at a community level, there's a whole bunch of conversations and trying to surface the stories, a bit similar in the same way as SROI does, from people who have been affected by your business or program, right? So it's finding the stories at that bottom level. And then depending on what size and jurisdiction you're looking at, there are then a number of levels of funneling those stories up and then choosing the ones that most demonstrate what you're looking to demonstrate in that business or whatever it is. And then eventually you get to a point where you've got somewhere between 3 and 6 stories, depending on the size of the organisation and what you're doing, which most demonstrate what your program service business does. So we have an example of one of these in the next conversation and activity, and we'll use that in the next.
So what's the story?
Sorry, a story.
What's the story?
So someone's lived experience of what it's meant to be involved in the project, service, business, etc.
I'll just jump in there and say it's actually very rare to see an impact report that doesn't include a story.
That's right. Yeah.
So even if it hasn't been arrived at through this process, often you will see, because it's more interesting to us as people, a picture of a person who's been through the program and their story, and it really sort of brings it to life. And one of my favourite mantras is no data without stories and no stories without data. And I think that's it's a good one to keep in mind, and to capture both meaning but also the audience of people who understand things in different ways.
And the last one that we wanted to just highlight with you is the London benchmarking group. And I want to be clear that these are the 4 we've looked at for change. We'll look at some others for transparency, but there are many, many more out there, right? We've just chosen these ones to highlight with you. But the LBG model, as you can see, kind of follows that logic model, if you see what we talked about before. But LBGs are mostly used by the corporate sector, with quite significantly large organisations. So Australia Post uses it. They've all disappeared now, but large corporations. Probably some of you have come across some of them that are using this. Yeah. So we might dive straight into the activity. So what we've got are, again, some reports on your tables which look at those 4 different tools, methodologies, frameworks. And we're just curious to understand which of these approaches and the way they've been reported you prefer and why.
Okay, sorry, as Kylie hands these out, what we would like you to do as a table is to come up with, in a minute I'm going to tell you which is your method, and we'd like you to come up with 3 ways in which your method is better than the other methods. So look at them in comparison and think about, from the one that we give you, 3 ways in which the method we give you is better. So, you ready? Your SROI. 3 ways in which SROI is better than the others, please. SROI, RBA. Yeah. MSC.
I'll get rid of the old ones.
Are we thinking about 3 ways that this is better than the others, or the other way around? So why is this better than the others? Oh, okay.
Dollar value.
Another SROI. Okay, we'll start with this table at the front. So you guys were nice and loud, please. So guys, when you are speaking about your method, please do it nice and loud, because in a way you're also teaching the groups who looked more closely at other methods about why yours is so wonderful.
Why ours is what, sorry?
So wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. All right. Good. We got SROI, and it's a nice, easily accessible, easy to digest, sexy number that equates an investment of $1 results in a cost saving, or elsewhere in the system, social return of $3.67 or $4.50. So that's a nice kind of headline piece, but then obviously the stories, and we've kind of talked about the need to integrate that with other measurement frameworks for a complete report, because it doesn't stand on its own, or it shouldn't.
Great. Next table.
So we looked at RBA, results-based accountability, and yeah, I mean, it's very visual. It's quite simple to read. This organisation is obviously a membership-based organisation who sort of done this work, and we're really open about some of the graphics in here, particularly those numbers that were going down, and sort of accounting for them. So the data visualisation is quite good. You can sort of see it, and it's easy to read. And there's stories behind the baseline. But probably the same again, you wouldn't sort of use this sort of standalone stuff, I think. I mean, I'm a bit of a fan of the most significant change, but yeah, I'd sort of would like to see more of that stuff in there.
Great.
Yeah.
Can I ask from here on, if you're speaking, to stand up and just make sure that you're facing everyone in the room? So, back table.
School.
I made the mistake of writing these down, and they're on the presenter. So
Can't read it right.
we did the most significant change piece, and I mean, admittedly, we only had the chance to scan this article, but it's about a lady in India, I believe, that's comparing the difference between breastfeeding and not breastfeeding her 2 children, her 2 daughters. It's deeply descriptive, but it's qualitative data. There's no numbers in there per se. But it's the things that we observed about this process that we saw as advantages were, and one of the good people from the Lotteries Commission here is recounting them as it relates to their experience, and increased awareness and appreciation across their organisation of what they're doing and the impact it was having. That's point number one. Point number two, it's relatable and it's personable, and that allows it to target an audience and a reader more specifically. This one, I think this is a really important one, quite powerful. It creates a why, and that generates speaks to the complexity of well-being that a number can't. And then finally, we sort of felt that this kind of anecdotal recount that happens over a long period of time can create a step change in thinking. And there's almost a hypothesis generation methodology in there that then perhaps can be tested by the numbers, but you need that observation to be able to get to that starting point. So it's us.
Right. Okay. Is the other table at the back?
Yeah, done the table at the back, on the last part at the back. We're looking at the LBG Bacardi method on their process. It gives a nice amount of data. It's clean, and they're turning around just looking at what their market or their targets are, etc., and how they've progressed through. Great marketing. I mean, how they do it, I suppose, as a method to deliver through. I'm personally like more detail, but it's very clear. It's very easy to read. Again, you wouldn't want to lift the hood under it, but the rest of it, it's great. They've got a 250% increase in overage drinkers coming and joining the fray, so that's fantastic. 100% of their marketing agency contracts are in compliance, so even better. But it's more just going through, have they ticked all their boxes and how they actually do it, putting down a prerequisite for what are they looking for and have they achieved it. And I think that's fairly clear, regardless of whether it's alcohol or whatever you're selling or buying. But it's that nice, clean, without getting too wordy, a really good 30-second grab or 60-second grab if you're out there marketing, as opposed to something that someone's going to sit down and read as a novel in bed at night because it's a 60-pager. So I think it's fairly short and sharp.
All right. All right, over to you guys. So we're starting to get a bit of repetition. Hopefully we'll have some new points. Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I made the same mistake of writing it down. And so ours is the SROI, and very similar comments to what Sven was saying, that everybody understands a number. 2.1 is better than 2, so that's simple. It's easy to compare. It's good for time for assessment, and I think this is, in a lot of cases, is pitched at investment dollars. So if you're an investment manager and you're trying to decide where you allocate your funds to, whether it's a housing project or it's a regen project or something else, you've got numbers ahead, in front of you. It's a pretty quick assessment, and that provides the entry point into delving into some of the more deeper data as presented by some of the other reports. And the last point is that we felt that it humanizes the investment element. It bridges that gap between finance and social quite well, because you've got different metrics in the one number.
Right. And our last table.
No, different.
So we also had results-based accountability. One comment that came from our table was that it was the only one they could understand. And I think in that way, the superiority of it, I think, is that it really democratizes the data compared to the other three. It's really clear in terms of what you're looking at, what it's reporting on. There's a lot of different charts of data across time in this particular example, but it doesn't presuppose what I, as the reader of this, should get out of it. It does provide some explanatory notes, but unlike the MSC, which is trying to elicit an emotional response almost, and the RSOI that has quite opaque assumptions and values judgment underpinning the final number, and the what was this one? The LGB, which when I was reading, I was like, oh, it's like a performance agreement at my work. I feel like this one provides, and it was the longest, but provided the most information and allowed each reader perhaps to take different things from their reading, overlaying with their own personal judgments that I think the others somewhat rob you of. Maybe that's a disadvantage if you're a corporate trying to share a message, but as a consumer, I liked this one the best. Not just because I was told to.
Awesome, well done. They were really great insights. Now, when we leave today, feel free to take the papers on your table. If other people on your table have a voracious appetite for papers and you would still like some, we do have some more copies. Okay?
But at these reports, there's no almost stopping to have both the things together. So like
No.
have SROI at the front, so it goes to a larger destination. But if someone wants to come and have more reads or things, and or you're performing, especially in Australia, RBA is a better one, so you can go back and see. Yes.
Yeah, and I think probably the reason that neither Kylie nor I are wedded to any particular method is because there are parts of each one that are really great and that you want to bring in, and it depends on the program. They were all easy to argue for. Perhaps LBG slightly less. You guys had a little bit of a difficult, possibly because I gave you McCarty as the example. But I wanted I wanted to show you that it's not just charities and sort of impact investment firms that are using these kinds of reports. They're also used by corporates who you would assume are not very interested in social impact at all. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. You said at the beginning too regarding results-based accountability that it's more popular in Australia than other parts of the world. Is it a cultural thing, or what's the basis for that?
I think it's the people who are promoting it. So these FAMs people also run the run training, and so in a way, like if you look at all these that as well as being measurement tools, they're also sort of marketing tools.
There's a whole industry. There's a whole industry that's like sort of emerging now around this, and I think that some organisations are using it just to kind of pad out their consultancy or sell a proprietary framework. I think there's a session next door for a proprietary framework, for example.
But yeah, I mean, you can see they use it well. So sort of what they're doing is an exemplar. Then they say to organisations, you want a report like us, we'll teach you how. And I think because they've been good at it, it's it's sort of extrapolated. So one thing that is important both with so the SRI and the MSC is that in the recording of stories, you record the words as they're spoken. So with both of those, the outcomes that you are striving for come from what people tell you happened to them. So you don't sort of say, oh, like, we're only going to ask people how much of this happened, how much of that happened. You say, tell me your story of change. And they'll say, so in that particular SROI, one of the things they didn't realise their program was striving for, but ended up being one of their biggest drivers of value, was a sense of belonging. They're sort of like, we're an educational program, we try and get kids through to year 12, but because of the activities they ran, there was huge value in the Indigenous kids when they learnt about their culture. Many of them had been separated from their culture, and they were learning a lot about culture, and they began to feel part of a community that they hadn't had a connection with before. That sense of belonging became one of their biggest outcomes. So in both of that, and I'd say, like any time you're interviewing people and asking them about change, if you don't know what your outcomes are, It's like, well, ask the people in your programs and ask them what's happened to them. But always record their words faithfully to what they're saying. And when you start recording those words, then you interview different people, you see them, the same things being mentioned over and over. And sometimes that's how you articulate your outcome, by having someone who's experiencing it tell you. Okay, so the way we've structured this session, at the beginning we sort of told you about indicators and outcomes, and we didn't spend a lot of time on how to actually measure that change in an indicator. Sometimes it's done through sort of surveys, sometimes we have those sort of quasi-experimental methods. There are many ways to do that, and it depends on sort of what you're measuring. Most of the time we're spending is on how to bring that together. So the 4 methods that you've just looked at are methods for sort of organising and reporting on those changes in indicators. But particularly when we look at the sort of more corporate end, and trying to standardise measurement across the globe so that we can start comparing things, we look at frameworks for transparency. Responsible investing is the wider umbrella of impact investing. Responsible investing is really just not doing anything irresponsible. It's usually responsible investing involves casting the negative screen. These are the things we will not invest in. I'm not sure, given that report, whether Bacardi would be in or out. Maybe they're trying to come in. But ESG, environmental, social and governance, this is really a way of sort of organising or framing up all the things that you might look at. So some organisations like to use this as an organiser, and you'll see it in one of the examples we're about to give you, where they've used ESG to organise. The Global Reporting Initiative was very much about having a global standard. Now, what it does is it rates on level of disclosure. So it doesn't rate on how much change you're making to someone's lives. It rates on whether you are getting a full, partial or no disclosure on a certain item. So what it's saying is, if you are transparent, if you are reporting on all these things we're telling you to report on, then you will strive to do them better, and you will be open to criticism from people who will be telling you to do them better. It can be used with ESG. So let's just have a look. Here's a disclosure under employment around parental leave. So the reporting organisation shall report on the total number of employees entitled to parental leave by gender, and the total number of employees that took parental leave by gender, and all these other things. You can see they start to look like standards. Yep, have you ticked off GR 101? So you could organise everything according to this. You could compare different organisations. And it is, there's no judgment. There's no, not good enough. It's only put it out there. You'll also see that there isn't, it's not a measure of change, it's like a measure of reporting. So GEARS, the Global Impact Investment Rating System, this is used for B-Corp certification. Sven's going to go into B-Corp in a bit more detail in a minute.
In a very short space of time.
But it uses IRIS. So IRIS is a library of indicators. So we were asked before, is there a list of indicators somewhere? Yes, IRIS is one. The indicators can be used to describe an organisation's social, environmental and financial performance. It's not a method, it doesn't tell you how to use them. It's just a list, really. It does not evaluate performance or provide a rating or grade. But GEARS does rate and rates across 4 areas: community, environment, workers and governance.
I might just do it quickly, is that okay? So this is Impact Seed's B-Corp score. You can't see it so well here, but this is the minimum to get B-Corp status. Sorry, so for those that don't know, B-Corp is an independent assessment. And so it's a...
That's
okay,
actually the minimum, sorry. This is all of the people that have ever filled out
I see,
an
right,
assessment.
okay, so that's the minimum. So what B Corp is an independent assessment, so you put the information in there, but they make an assessment and they talk to you about your information and then say, yes, we're happy to give you this score, right? But it goes through in depth things like what your diversity inclusion policies look like, what your suppliers and distributors look like, what your employment policies are, and how, for example, how much is your lowest paid person paid as a proportion of your highest paid person, et cetera, et cetera. So it's only for corporates and businesses, and it's very much a, so not-for-profit can't have B Corp certification. And the idea is really this transparency, as Emma's talking about. So yeah, 80 is the minimum. We're an 83.4. We would think of ourselves as pretty ethical, but the way that some of the questions are framed, that's probably a conversation we can go into in more detail at another point.
Just for reference, IIG is 86.
Yeah.
So I think there's very few companies that get more than 120, and I think that's quite good because they're trying to gear towards improvement towards the 200.
Yeah, we'll just skip that one. Yeah, so we've got an example. So, thanks Emma. So I'm going to go through now some of the frameworks that you can use to organise information. So this IIG was one of the reports we gave you in the first exercise to have a look on the table. What they've done is combine that impact management tool, which we talked about at the very beginning, with obviously the sustainable development goals, which is what we've got you looking at on your tables. So they've pulled in 2 different frameworks that we've spoken about to structure their kind of impact assessment of how their portfolio is going and performing. The Sustainable Development Goals are a really interesting and useful framework to map up to. Now, they're very popular. Most of you have probably seen that a lot of businesses use the SDGs to map to. It's important to be really clear that as a framework, it doesn't help you measure anything, right? All you can do is use some of the tools, frameworks, methodologies that we've talked about, and then sort of align or order your impact according to the SDGs. Does that make sense? Yeah, so sometimes it's
so the IIG one on your table, use this. So these might already be looking a bit familiar. You see those little pictures and then their indicators next to them.
And this is just the one that you've got on your table. No. So you can see what they've done is rolled up the impact that they've got at an investment level and rolled that up to, okay, well in terms of good health and well-being, what does that look like? Well, we've, $1 million estimated healthcare savings in financial year 2019. So they've just rolled up what it looks like at an individual investment level to understand what it looks like at their fund level, and then map those things to the SDGs that are relevant. And there are some really useful tools to help you do that, and particularly for Australia too. So hang on, just let me go forward one note. So underneath each of these is indicators. So we've been talking about different kinds of indicators. There are certain indicators that sit underneath these that have goals attached to them that the UN is looking to achieve. And so what you can do is have a look at those indicators and be like, oh, is that something that's relevant to us? Is that information we already collect or we could easily collect? And then use that to be able to map up to the SDGs. So in that sense, the fact that they have indicators that underpin what they're looking for, in that sense it's useful because you can pull those indicators and use them if they're relevant. But yeah, it's just really important to be clear that you can't use the SDGs to measure, which I think is a common kind of perception. Another framework that hopefully will still be eventually be announced in WA is the whole of state government outcomes framework. So this is a project I have been working on with WACOS, the Western Australian Council of Social Service, and with Department of Premier and Cabinet and with Department of Finance. And so we just briefed the Cabinet subcommittee last week, which means hopefully Cabinet will sign it off and then it will be released. But from the perspective of thinking about frameworks that you map to, in the same way as the SDGs can be mapped to, if you're doing work in WA, this is a good one to map to, right? For that reason. So it's going to be something that looks at, it's kind of like thinking about what a good life looks like from the perspective of a person. And these are ordering domains. And so you've got population level outcomes around the outside, and then indicators and sort of short-term outcomes in the middle. And I was going to show you, well, I might just, if you're interested, come talk to me about it afterwards. But underneath this sits an indicators bank, which is the piece that is not yet publicly available. This is, but the indicators bank is really where the rubber hits the road, right? Because it's got the population level outcomes mapped to sub-outcomes, so short, medium-term outcomes, mapped to indicators, mapped to measures, mapped to data sources. And that kind of is, you know, all the way through what we really like to see.
So if you were to do a wellbeing index, this is what sits underneath that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the third kind of framework I wanted to highlight with you is the state government's priorities. So again, if you're operating in WA and you're doing work related to these priorities, if you can map and align to them, that's really valuable. So they're across 6 different domains, and I won't read them all out. A livable environment, so looking at sort of conservation for future generations. At least 75% of waste generated in WA is recycled or reused. Aboriginal wellbeing, which I have and you know, a lot of people have challenges with, given that the sole indicator for Aboriginal wellbeing is reducing Indigenous incarceration. So that has been a big issue for the sector in particular, that's the sole way we're describing Aboriginal wellbeing. And strong economy and regional prosperity focus on job creation, largely. But if there is anything that you're doing that relates, you know, to a bright future, improving the health and wellbeing of children, looking at a safer community, so reducing youth reoffending, given that this is what all of the state government departments are orienting their activity towards for the next, however long they have, really. It's a really good way to be thinking about, hey, how am I mapping towards these priorities? And the government people in the room will be very familiar with the priorities. And so this is just to demonstrate that our priorities are mapped to then the state government outcomes framework, right? So it all sits together, nested concepts. So has anyone got any questions on those? I've done that a little quicker than I would like. Has anyone got any questions about those frameworks? And we've only chosen really to showcase a couple of frameworks to you. There's other organising frameworks out there, but these ones I think are quite relevant for us in WA.
My question was just resources, because obviously so much is just awesome. You want to explore it further.
Totally. So we, so some of these have links in it, and when we send you this PowerPoint, we'll send you, it will have the links in it, obviously. The final slide of this has some useful resources that I've put, so I'll send that as well. And we'll find the one that Emma mentioned as well and send that out as well. But if then in your practice, if there's any particular kinds of areas where you're like, oh, I wonder if a tool or resource exists for that, just email us and we can help you find your way to where it might be.
Bring this stuff on Wednesday.
Yeah.
I think that
Any other questions on those?
No, just a comment.
Yeah.
There's nothing there in empowered.
Yeah, to be fair, what we tried to do here is just kind of place them in their primary domain. I think that you could argue that you know, they go across things, but it's a very astute observation because actually it was brought up in a couple of other sessions and we're like, oh yeah, that's what's so good, is it? But yes, that's true, but I think they do reach across all this. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay, so we might get you started on the final exercise. Emma to do that.
We're just giving you another pack of reports. So there's 3 more reports.
Get one.
These reports, one of them is carbon footprint. Some people are doing carbon, so we thought we'd give you a carbon one from a shoemaker.
I'm not taking any notes.
But also, I think those two
That's how we show love.
Why do I get the biggest one?
I think everyone does report like this now. Doesn't it? Because we do that. It's the same way, like even like how many jobs created.
guys, I'll just give you a task. What we'd like you to do is just have a look at these three, but some of the other reports will be useful as well. And what we want you to think about is in terms of organising indicators and information, which frameworks would actually be useful to your organisation. So you don't want to throw together every framework in the one in the hope that everybody thinks it's just like theirs. Think about which of these organisations has used the organising frameworks to help make the information more meaningful, easier to read, and which ones might apply to you. We won't get you to report back. This is about takeaways.
Alright, I might just pull your attention back. I'm sorry we had less time for that one. But I like to finish on time, so if people need to leave, it's good. But if you want to hang around for conversation, you're more than welcome to. So I guess this is the final thought that I would leave with you, and that is that this idea that we can absolutely measure everything and put all of the rigour and the robustness around it can sometimes kill the very thing that we're trying to do. So as much as Emma and I really believe in measurement and measuring outcomes and all of the kinds of tools and frameworks that we've gone through to measure outcomes, it can be problematic, and it's just worth being really clear about that. So these are some of the additional resources that we really like that will come out with the PowerPoint. But apart from that, if you have any other questions or we can help with referring you any other way, just let us know. Yeah. Thank you.